I think this article emerged when I was a PhD student at the London School of Economics in an entirely different type of area, and I kept following the space news. And I was just increasingly surprised at how all my international relations friends and colleagues seemed to kind of ignore, or at least not be entirely aware of what was happening. And of course, they were angry when Jeff Bezos went to space for 11 minutes. But after that, I think the interest quickly faded, and we didn't have that much conversations about it, debates about it. And I thought maybe critical IR scholars should start paying attention, especially because there's so much that we see happening around us that is going to go really fast, and that we don't want to be too late in terms of adding critical perspectives. And I think that's when I reached out to Darshan.
Yeah, so Enrike came back from London, and she's looking for work in the Netherlands, which is her home. And she came to my office. We'd worked together before on an article for political geography, but this was a new project that she wanted to pitch. And she said, Dar, I think we should work on the politics of outer space. And my initial reaction was that's this terrible idea, right? Don't do that. It's going to be bad for your career. And it's probably what many of our readers think at the very beginning of this article. Is what are these people doing? And
why?
Yeah, why? And then 2 hours later, after I'd actually given it some proper thought and taken away my sort of very conservative IR brain, I thought this is actually a fantastic idea, and we should definitely work on this. So I guess first part of the article is dealing with that tension between us.
And also I think dealing with that first reaction that you had, which is kind of what we anticipate that a lot of our readers might have too.
Yeah.
So the first thing that we do in the paper is that we talk about kind of common misconceptions around the politics of outer space and why it may not be that relevant specifically to IR scholars. So I think the first one is that space is small.
Yeah,
right?
This is like that. Even though we know that space is vast,
yes,
in IR brains, it occupies this very, very tiny realm where it's war, trade, all the big things have a much bigger role.
Yes.
And so I guess we tackle that by saying, by trying to just lay out how big things your stuff on satellites and how massive this infrastructure is, how much investment there is in outer space developments and resources, and just simply doing the slow work of accumulating just the size of the space sector.
Exactly. And then the second one kind of builds on that a little bit to say the kind of presumption that space in some ways is not relevant to earthly politics is also in many ways misconceived, mostly because many of the things that IR scholars are already concerned with, like inequality, climate change, migration, are going to be so seriously impacted by the space sector, and that's in different ways. So I think one example that we use is to talk about also the history of the space sector and the history of space development, which is often or almost always gone hand in hand with displacement of indigenous peoples and modes of control over territory. And the third one is kind of the funny one, perhaps.
Yeah, this is the one that I think probably speaks more to the inner workings of IR politics and how people are perceived, and that is probably the understanding that, or the belief that outer space is going to be one of those new areas for nerds, geeks, and tech bros, right?
Tech bros.
And whilst we think that that's possibly the case, we think there's so much critical work to do here. And actually the colleagues that we come across in anthropology or geography who are doing this are not the tech bros, right? They are people who are really interested in finely grained analysis of sometimes the colonial politics, the gendered politics of outer space.
Yes, and it's also really important in some ways, or at least we think, that the non-tech bros amongst us also start paying attention. Yeah. So the play that we have and the title of the article, which is obviously called The Terrestrial Trap, and this is obviously a play on Agnew's The Territorial Trap, which was about the state as a container of politics and kind of a certain geographical imagination and ordering that we kind of presume is at the core of politics and is not changing. And he criticized that and allowed us to kind of start thinking beyond that and kind of unravel what that has done to us in terms of imagining politics in the first place. And we try to do that with what we call the terrestrial trap. So this idea that kind of the Earth-centric conceptions of politics underpin the subject matter of international relations in a very kind of far-reaching sense, to an extent that it's hard to think about international relations beyond Earth with the same terminology that we're used to thinking. We're also aware, though, that the terrestrial trap is different than from the territorial trap in some ways, more specifically because, of course, we acknowledge that there is some difference between outer space and Earth. So it's not just an imaginary construct. But the question is really kind of, where does Earth begin and end? And there's a lot of contestations within space politics around that, where the atmosphere begins and ends. So we talk about it both as an imagination, so a way of thinking about Earth as opposed to space, but also as a material kind of difference that we have to grapple with if we want to understand the politics of space.
Yeah, and then so the rest of the article is mostly about, it's one of those traditional IR bush clearing exercises, right? It's a theoretical article where we're trying to go, what sort of intellectual baggage do we have to leave behind if we want to go to outer space? And we take two things. And the first thing is the concept which we call flat earthism. Now, flat earthism is not the what you're thinking of, right? The idea that the Earth ends at a certain point and you just fall off if you're going in your boat in that direction. It's more this idea that that we in IR conceptualize politics as a phenomenon that plays out on a two-dimensional surface that roughly corresponds to the Mercator projection of the Earth's surface, right? That we basically think about politics in a very flat way. Even when we've undone or unbundled territory and we're thinking in terms of colonial configurations or different forms of spatiality, and even when we're critical of territorial politics, we fail to consider what happens when you go up and when you go down. And this is something that geographers have been doing for ages, right? So this is not particularly revolutionary for us, right? But anything that engages with verticality, volumetric politics, begins to compel us to think about outer space and the relationships between spatial units on Earth and outer space in a different way. And we need to remove that flat earthist assumption if we're going to engage with outer space politics.
Yeah, and I also think to build on that, there's some specific examples when it comes to that in terms of space specifically, other than how it may have been studied by geographers not focused on space, is that the spatial dimension of rotation of the ISS as a political form has some specificities that we're specifically looking at in developing flat earthism as something that pertains to outer space.
Yeah.
And then the second thing...
when you abandon flat earthism, that doesn't mean all your problems are solved, right?
No.
And then this is where you came in with this second assumption, right?
Yeah, because it's one thing to think about, going up to space, but there's also something that I mentioned before, which is about the conditions of space being fundamentally different from those on Earth. And oftentimes you see in the literature on space and in thinking of space politically, that dimension of the materiality of space itself gets reduced. So the idea is, and this is helpful in some ways as well, this is not to discredit that type of work, but that political forms on Earth, be it colonialism, capitalism, that those will be extended to space, and that's kind of the moment that we're in, politically speaking. And even though there's clear attempts to do so, and that's also what we talk about in the article, there's also kind of limits to those types of extension when we talk about outer space politics. So the second assumption that we try to challenge in the paper, we call habitationism. And the idea is that presumes that politics in space will be some kind of logical extension from politics as it developed on the habitable surface of planet Earth. And what we try to show by challenging that assumption is that there's different ways in which politics actually has to be conducted really differently in outer space, mostly because the conditions that we're used to experiencing, like sitting on a chair and breathing in this room, are not there in the same way. So that means that all types of different configurations between humans, non-humans, who were the first spacefarers, but also materials, need to be very different. And in order to develop that, we also draw on some work by IR scholars, by geographers who already do that in terms of thinking about space in other extreme areas like deep seas and the polar regions. But we developed that specifically to talk about the challenges of outer space. And kind of also to think about outer space not just as a different environment, but also in some ways as an anti-human environment, how we call it. That the forces of space work quite clearly in a way that it damages human infrastructures, but it also threatens human life. And that's something that we think needs to be taken seriously in order to be able to theorize the developments that we're in.
I think that's mostly
it.
I mean, but just to say, like, if you do happen to read the piece, I know this video is a great introduction to it, but like, if you do want to read it, I mean, it's a first step for us in this project, which we felt was necessary to reorient our brains in order to prepare ourselves to do the sort of critical work that we want to do.
Yeah.
We hope it serves the same purpose for colleagues.
Exactly, and I think that's also where we end. At the end of this piece, we try to call for other types of sustained engagement with outer space, whether that's theoretical, empirical. We're really interested to see where others take this as well. So if you'd be interested,
Get in touch.
Do that work.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, thanks.